The bullet that grazed Ryder Walsh's shoulder in the spring of 1878 didn't hurt nearly as much as the memory of finding his fiancée in another man's arms 3 years prior, and he figured that pretty much summed up his entire philosophy on love versus everything else in this hard territory of southern Arizona. He pressed a hand against the wound as his horse carried him toward Nogales, the border town that straddled Arizona and Mexico like a woman with one foot in two different worlds. The sun beat down mercilessly on the desert landscape, turning the scattered saguaro cacti into dark sentinels against the bleached sky. Ryder had been trailing a group of cattle rustlers for the better part of a week, and his only reward was a shallow furrow in his flesh, and the knowledge that he was getting too old for this kind of work at 29. The town emerged from the heat shimmer like a mirage made solid, adobe buildings and wooden storefronts clustered together in defiance of the harsh land. Ryder guided his horse down the main street, aware of the curious glances from townspeople who noticed the blood seeping through his shirt. He needed a doctor, a drink, and a bed, probably in that order, though his thirst might argue otherwise. "You look like you've had a rough time of it," a woman's voice called out, stopping him mid-street. Ryder turned his head to find the source and immediately wished he hadn't, because the woman standing on the boardwalk outside the general store was the kind of beautiful that made a man forget his own name. She had honey-colored hair pulled back in a practical bun, though several strands had escaped to frame a face that belonged in a painting rather than this dusty border town. Her dress was simple calico, faded from washing but clean, and her brown eyes held an intelligence that suggested she saw far more than most people wanted to reveal. "I've had better days," Ryder admitted, his voice rougher than he intended. "The doctor's office is 2 buildings down on the left," she said, stepping off the boardwalk with the kind of purposeful stride that suggested she wasn't asking permission. "But Dr. Henderson is 3 towns over delivering a baby. I can help you with that wound if you'll let me." "I don't need help from a stranger," Ryder said automatically, even as his shoulder throbbed in protest of this statement. "Then it's fortunate I'm not planning to be a stranger for long," she replied with a smile that was somehow both gentle and determined. "I'm Helena Morrison. I run the general store, and before you ask, yes, I know how to treat a gunshot wound. My father was a field surgeon during the war, and he taught me everything he knew before he passed." Ryder wanted to refuse. He'd spent the last 3 years keeping people at arm's length, especially women who smiled like they knew secrets about the universe that could make a man reconsider his entire existence. But his shoulder was bleeding steadily, and he was practical enough to know when pride would be the death of him. "Ryder Walsh," he said finally, "and I'd be obliged for the help." Helena nodded and gestured toward the store. "Come on then, before you bleed all over the street and scare away my customers." The interior of the general store was cooler, thank God, and smelled of coffee, tobacco, and the indefinable scent of dry goods that seemed universal to such establishments. Helena led him past shelves stocked with everything from canned peaches to ammunition, through a doorway at the back that opened into a small living area. It was tidy and feminine without being fussy, with curtains at the windows and a colorful quilt thrown over a worn settee. "Sit," she commanded, pointing at a chair by a scrubbed wooden table. "And take off that shirt so I can see what we're dealing with." Ryder complied, wincing as he peeled the fabric away from the wound. Helena lit a lamp despite the daylight, moving with efficient grace as she gathered supplies from a cabinet. Water, clean cloths, a bottle of whiskey, needle, and thread. "This is going to hurt," she warned, pouring whiskey over the wound without waiting for his response. Ryder hissed through his teeth, but didn't cry out, which seemed to earn him a slight nod of approval. Helena bent close, examining the injury with a clinical eye that would have been entirely professional if Ryder hadn't been hyper-aware of her proximity. The scent of lavender soap that clung to her skin, the way her fingers were surprisingly gentle as they probed the damaged flesh. "You're lucky," she said. "It's just a graze, deep enough to bleed, but nothing that won't heal clean if you take care of it. No stitches needed, just a good bandaging." "What happened?" "Cattle rustlers," Ryder said shortly. "I work for the territorial marshal's office, track down thieves and troublemakers." "Sounds dangerous." "It's a living." Helena began cleaning the wound properly, her touch as gentle as her earlier assessment had been thorough. "You're not much of a talker, are you?" "Don't see the point in wasting words." "Talking isn't wasting," Helena replied, wrapping clean bandages around his shoulder with practiced efficiency. "It's how people get to know each other, how they build connections. Humans are social creatures, Mr. Walsh. We're not meant to go through life alone." "Some of us do better that way," Ryder said, the words coming out harsher than he intended. Helena paused in her bandaging, meeting his eyes with a directness that made him want to look away. "Or some of us have been hurt and decided it's easier to be alone than risk being hurt again. There's a difference between preferring solitude and hiding from life." "You don't know anything about me," Ryder said. "I know you let yourself get shot chasing after cattle thieves for probably not enough pay," Helena replied, securing the bandage with a neat knot. "I know you ride alone even though most lawmen travel in pairs for safety. I know you have sad eyes and a way of holding yourself like you're expecting disappointment. That tells me plenty." Ryder stood abruptly, reaching for his shirt despite the way the movement pulled at his shoulder. "I should pay you for your time and supplies." "Consider it a welcome to Nogales," Helena said, not moving from where she stood. "Though I expect you're just passing through like most men who do your kind of work." "That was the plan," Ryder admitted, buttoning his shirt with fingers that felt clumsy. "Rest a day or two, then head back north." "Well, while you're resting, you're welcome to take your meals at the hotel. Sarah Chen runs the dining room there, and she makes the best chicken and dumplings this side of the Mississippi. Or," and here Helena's voice took on a slightly different quality, softer somehow, "you could come back here tomorrow evening and I'll make you dinner. Properly, I mean, not just as payment for medical services. As a friend." Ryder looked at her, this woman who had appeared in his life less than an hour ago and was already complicating things. "I'm not looking for friends, Miss Morrison, or anything else." "I didn't ask what you were looking for," Helena said mildly. "I offered you dinner. You can say yes or no without making it into something bigger." That should have been the end of it. Ryder should have said no, should have walked out of that store and found a room at the hotel and left Nogales as soon as his shoulder stopped aching. But there was something in Helena's eyes, some quality of warmth and genuine human kindness that he hadn't encountered in longer than he cared to remember, and he found himself saying, "What time?" The smile that lit up Helena's face was like sunrise over the desert, slow and golden and impossibly beautiful. 7 o'clock. Don't be late." Ryder left the store feeling distinctly unsettled, like he'd just agreed to something far more significant than a simple meal. He found a room at the hotel, a small space with a narrow bed and a window overlooking the street, and spent the rest of the day trying to convince himself that he could still change his mind, that he could ride out of town before 7 o'clock tomorrow and never look back. But when evening came the next day, he found himself washing up carefully, changing into his one clean shirt, and walking back toward the general store with his heart beating faster than it had any right to. Helena answered his knock almost immediately, as if she'd been waiting nearby. She'd changed from her calico work dress into something slightly nicer, a deep blue that brought out the gold in her hair, and she'd let it down so it fell in waves past her shoulders. She looked younger this way, and Ryder found himself wondering about her age. Mid-20s, probably, old enough to have some life experience but still possessing an optimism that he'd lost somewhere along the way. "You came," she said, and there was genuine pleasure in her voice. "I said I would," Ryder replied. "People don't always do what they say." Helena stepped back to let him in. The store was closed now, shutters drawn, and she led him through to her living quarters where a small table had been set for two. The smell of roasting chicken filled the air, along with fresh bread and something sweet. "I hope you're hungry," Helena said, moving to the stove where pots bubbled and steamed. "I may have gotten carried away." "Smells good," Ryder said, feeling awkward and out of place in this domestic scene. When was the last time someone had cooked for him? Years, probably. He took his meals at hotels and saloons, quick fuel for a body that was always moving. They ate, and Helena talked. She told him about growing up in Pennsylvania, about how her father had never recovered from what he'd seen during the war, how he'd brought his family west hoping the open spaces would heal something broken inside him. She talked about losing her mother to fever, her father to grief and whiskey, about finding herself at 22 suddenly alone and in possession of a general store in a border town where she knew no one. "That was 4 years ago," she said, passing him more bread. "I thought about selling, going back east where I had cousins, but something kept me here. This place gets under your skin if you let it. The desert, the mountains, the way the sky goes on forever. It's hard country, but it's honest. I appreciate that." "It's brutal," Ryder said. "It kills people who aren't careful, who aren't strong enough." "It's life," Helena countered. "Everywhere kills people eventually. At least here you can see trouble coming from a long way off, most of the time. There's something to be said for that kind of clarity." Ryder found himself studying her in the lamplight, this woman who spoke about hardship with such matter-of-fact acceptance, who had clearly suffered losses but hadn't let them curdle into bitterness. "How do you stay so positive, after everything you've lost?" Helena was quiet for a moment, considering. "I don't know that I'm positive so much as I'm determined. I decided after my father died that I could let grief consume me, or I could live the life he wanted for himself but never achieved. I chose to live. Every day I choose that." "It's not always that simple." "No," Helena agreed. "It's not. But simple and easy aren't the same thing. The choice is simple, even when making it is the hardest thing in the world." After dinner, they sat on her small porch that faced the back of the property, looking out at the desert turned silver under a bright moon. Helena brought coffee, and they drank it in companionable silence for a while before she asked, "What happened to you, Ryder Walsh? What made you so determined to be alone?" Ryder's first instinct was to deflect, to change the subject or simply leave. But there was something about the night, the quiet, the way Helena waited without pushing, that loosened the words he'd kept locked away. "I was engaged once," he said finally. "Back in Texas before I took this job. Her name was Catherine. We'd known each other since we were children, and getting married seemed like the natural thing to do. I thought I loved her. I thought she loved me." "What happened?" "I came home early one day from a cattle drive and found her with someone else. The banker's son, if it matters, though I suppose it doesn't. She said she was sorry, that she'd made a mistake, but I saw the truth in her eyes. She'd never loved me the way I loved her. I was convenient, familiar, but not what she really wanted." Helena made a soft sound of sympathy. "That must have been terrible." "It was 3 years ago," Ryder said, as if that made a difference. "I left town the next week, took a job with the marshal's office, and I've been moving ever since." "Easier that way. No attachments, no expectations, no one to disappoint or be disappointed by. That sounds lonely. It's safe. Helena turned to look at him directly. Life isn't meant to be safe, Ryder. It's meant to be lived. What happened to you was cruel and unfair, but hiding from love because of one woman's betrayal means she's still controlling your life. Is that really what you want? I'm not hiding, Ryder protested, but even he could hear how weak it sounded. You're in a profession that keeps you constantly moving, you don't let anyone get close, and you're arguing with a woman you barely know rather than admitting you're scared. That's hiding. Helena's voice was gentle but firm. And there's no shame in being scared. Vulnerability is terrifying. But it's also the only way to really connect with another person. Ryder wanted to argue, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, he found himself asking, "Why do you care?" "You don't know me." "I'd like to," Helena said simply. "I haven't met anyone in the 4 years I've been here who made me want to know them better. Until you rode into town bleeding and stubborn and clearly carrying more wounds than the one in your shoulder. I look at you and I see someone who's forgotten how to hope, and that breaks my heart because hope is the most important thing we have." They sat in silence after that, but it wasn't uncomfortable. The night air was cool, a relief after the day's heat, and somewhere in the distance a coyote called. Ryder found himself thinking about hope, about whether he'd really lost it or just locked it away somewhere safe. When he finally stood to leave, Helena walked him to the front of the store. At the door, she touched his arm lightly. "Will you come back? Tomorrow, I mean. I'm not asking for promises or commitments. Just come back and we'll talk some more." Ryder knew what the smart answer was. He knew he should say no, should pack up his things and ride out at first light, should put distance between himself and this woman who was asking him to feel things he'd sworn off. "I'll come back," he heard himself say. Helena's smile was worth whatever risk he was taking. "Good. I'll make enchiladas. There's a woman here in town, Maria Rodriguez, who taught me her grandmother's recipe, and I've been wanting an excuse to make them." The next few days fell into a pattern that both alarmed and pleased Ryder. His shoulder healed quickly under Helena's care, but he found reasons to stay in Nogales. The marshal's office didn't expect him back on any particular schedule. There were always small jobs in town, men needing help repairing fences or moving supplies, enough to keep him occupied during the day and earning a bit of extra money. But the evenings belonged to Helena. He took dinner with her each night and they talked. God, how they talked. Helena had a curiosity about the world that was infectious, and she drew stories out of Ryder that he'd forgotten he possessed. Memories of his childhood in Texas, of learning to ride before he could properly walk, of summers spent swimming in creeks that ran cool and clear. She told him about her dreams, too. How she wanted to expand the store, maybe start ordering books and create a small lending library for the town. How she believed education was the key to building a better future. How she'd been teaching some of the local children to read in the evenings when their parents would allow it. "Doesn't that cut into your time?" Ryder asked one evening as they sat on her porch, the ritual that had become his favorite part of each day. "I make time for what matters," Helena replied. "Those children deserve a chance at something better. If I can give them that, why wouldn't I?" Ryder found himself watching her as she spoke, the animation in her face, the way her hands moved to emphasize her points. She was beautiful, yes, but more than that. She was passionate about life in a way that made him want to be passionate too. She made him want to believe that the world could be good, that people could be trusted, that love might be worth the risk. It terrified him. 2 weeks after arriving in Nogales, Ryder was helping Helena inventory stock in the store when 3 rough-looking men walked in. He recognized the type immediately: drifters, possibly worse, The kind of men who made their living on the wrong side of the law and didn't care who they hurt in the process. "Help you gentlemen?" Helena asked pleasantly, but Ryder noticed how her hand moved slightly closer to the pistol she kept under the counter. "We need supplies," the leader said, a scarred man with cold eyes. "Ammunition, food, whiskey, and we're not looking to pay full price." "Everything in this store has a fair price," Helena said firmly. "I don't negotiate." The man's expression darkened. "That's not real friendly, lady. Maybe you need someone to explain how things work around here." Ryder stepped forward, positioning himself between Helena and the men. "The lady said no. I suggest you move along." The scarred man looked Ryder up and down, clearly evaluating whether he was worth the trouble. Ryder kept his expression neutral, his hand resting casually near his own weapon. The message was clear enough. After a long moment, the man spat on the floor and turned toward the door. "This ain't over," he muttered, and his companions followed him out. Helena exhaled slowly. "Thank you. Those men have been causing trouble in town for the past week. Sheriff Jenkins is getting too old to handle them, and they know it." "They'll be back," Ryder said, not bothering to soften the truth. "Men like that don't like being told no, especially not by a woman." "Then I'll deal with them when they return," Helena said, but Ryder could see the worry in her eyes. That night, Ryder lay awake in his hotel room, staring at the ceiling and thinking. He should leave. Every instinct he'd developed over the past 3 years told him to saddle his horse and ride away before he got any more involved. But the thought of Helena facing those men alone made his chest tight with an emotion he didn't want to name. The next morning he sought out Sheriff Jenkins, a gray-haired man who looked tired in the way of someone who'd seen too much and had too little support. "Those 3 men," Ryder said without preamble. "The ones causing trouble. What's their story?" Jenkins sighed. "Frank Deacon and his boys. They ride through every few months, steal what they can, rough up anyone who gets in their way. I've wired the marshal's office, but by the time anyone arrives, they're long gone. They threatened Miss Morrison yesterday, I heard." Jenkins looked pained. "Helena's good people. This town wouldn't be half of what it is without her. But I'm one old man with a badge, and Deacon has 2 guns backing him up. Math isn't in my favor." Ryder made a decision then, one that both surprised and felt inevitable. "I'm staying for a while. If Deacon comes back, I'll handle it." Relief washed over Jenkins's face. "You do that. I know you work for the territory, but this isn't technically your jurisdiction. Consider it a favor," Ryder said. "For a friend." That evening he told Helena what he'd done. They were in her kitchen, and she was teaching him how to make the enchiladas she'd promised weeks ago. Her hands stilled in their work of rolling corn tortillas, and she looked at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. "You're staying because of me," she said softly. "I'm staying because those men are dangerous and this town needs help," Ryder replied, not quite able to admit the fuller truth. Helena set down the tortilla and moved closer to him, close enough that he could see the gold flecks in her brown eyes. "Ryder Walsh, you are a terrible liar." "I'm out of practice," he admitted. "I've spent 3 years not caring enough about anyone to bother lying. And now I care," Ryder said, the words feeling like they were being pulled from somewhere deep inside him. "I don't want to believe me, but I care about what happens to you. I care about seeing your smile every evening. I care about the way you talk about making the world better like it's actually possible. You make me want to believe in things again, Helena, and that scares the hell out of me." Helena reached up and touched his face, her palm warm against his cheek. "Love is scary. It means giving someone the power to hurt you and trusting they won't. After what happened to you, I understand why that feels impossible, but I'm not Catherine Ryder. I don't make promises I can't keep, and I don't play games with people's hearts. What are you saying?" Ryder asked, his voice rough. "I'm saying I've fallen in love with you," Helena said, simple and direct as everything else about her. "I didn't plan to. I didn't even think I wanted to. But somewhere between fixing your shoulder and listening to your stories and watching you pretend you don't have the kindest heart I've ever encountered, it happened. And I think you love me too, even if you're too stubborn to admit it." Ryder wanted to deny it, to protect himself with the walls he'd built so carefully. But looking into Helena's open, honest face, he found he couldn't. The walls were already crumbling, had been since the moment she'd called out to him on that dusty street. "I'm broken," he said instead. "I don't know if I remember how to love someone properly." "Then we'll figure it out together," Helena replied. "Love isn't something you do perfectly from the start, Ryder. It's something you build, piece by piece, day by day. I'm not asking you to be perfect. I'm asking you to try." So he kissed her, there in her kitchen with the smell of cooking food and spices in the air, and it felt like coming home after years of wandering. Helena kissed him back with a sweetness that made his chest ache, her arms wrapping around his neck, and Ryder thought maybe, just maybe, hope wasn't such a foolish thing after all. The trouble with Frank Deacon came 4 days later, just before sunset. Ryder was at the store, had practically moved in there at this point, sleeping on Helena's settee despite her offers of something more. He wanted to do this right, to court her properly despite the fact that they'd already confessed their feelings. Helena deserved that kind of respect. They heard the gunshots first, then shouting. Ryder grabbed his gun belt and was out the door before Helena could protest, though she followed close behind with her own pistol. The scene on the main street was chaotic. Deacon and his men had apparently decided to take what they wanted from the saloon, and when the owner protested, they'd started shooting. One man lay wounded in the street, and Sheriff Jenkins was pinned down behind a water trough, returning fire but clearly outmatched. Ryder assessed the situation in seconds. Deacon was using the saloon's porch for cover, while his 2 companions fired from positions on either side of the street. It was a good tactical setup, and they clearly hadn't expected organized resistance. "Stay here," Ryder told Helena, then moved before she could argue. He came at them from an angle, using buildings for cover, and his first shot took one of Deacon's men in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending his gun flying. The second man turned toward this new threat, but Sheriff Jenkins used the distraction to land a shot that put him down. That left Deacon, who realized his advantage had evaporated and made a run for the horses tied outside the saloon. Ryder stepped into the street, gun leveled. "Don't," he called out. "It's over, Deacon. Surrender and you'll get a trial. Run and I'll put you down." Deacon turned, his gun coming up, and for a frozen moment Ryder thought he'd have to kill him. But then Deacon saw something behind Ryder that made him hesitate, and Ryder realized Helena had moved into the street, her own gun trained on the outlaw. "She's right," Helena said calmly. "It's over. You can walk away from this alive if you're smart." The fight went out of Deacon all at once. He dropped his gun and raised his hands, and Jenkins moved in quickly to secure him with irons. The townspeople who'd been hiding emerged cautiously, several men moving to help the wounded, others surrounding Deacon and his men with an anger that suggested the outlaws had pushed this community too far. Helena lowered her gun and turned to Ryder. "Are you hurt?" "No," he said, adrenaline still singing through his veins. "But you shouldn't have exposed yourself like that. If he'd fired, he didn't," Helena interrupted. "And I wasn't going to hide while you risked your life for this town. We're in this together, remember. That's what love means." Ryder pulled her close, not caring who saw, and held her tight. She was trembling slightly, the aftermath of fear, but her arms around him were steady and strong. The town threw a celebration that night, grateful for the end of Deacon's harassment and the bravery of both Ryder and their own Sheriff Jenkins. The saloon opened its doors and offered free drinks, and someone produced a fiddle, and despite the violence of the afternoon, people danced and laughed with the particular joy of those who have survived danger together. Ryder and Helena slipped away early, walking back to the store under a sky brilliant with stars. Inside, Helena lit lamps and they stood in her small living room, the sounds of celebration distant now. "I love you," Ryder said, the words coming easier this time. "I fought it, tried to protect myself, but you were right. I'm not hiding anymore. I love you, Helena Morrison, and if you'll have me, I'd like to stay in Nogales. Not as someone passing through, but as someone who's finally found a home." Helena's eyes shone with tears, but she was smiling. "I'll have you, Ryder Walsh. Today, tomorrow, and all the days after that. We'll build a life here together." They married a month later in a ceremony performed by the traveling minister who made rounds through the small border towns. It was simple, held in the church at the edge of town, with what seemed like everyone in Nogales crammed into the pews. Helena wore a dress of cream-colored lace that she'd ordered special from Tucson, and Ryder wore his best suit, brushed clean of trail dust and pressed until the creases were sharp. Sheriff Jenkins stood up with Ryder, and Maria Rodriguez stood with Helena, and when the minister pronounced them man and wife, the kiss they shared felt like a promise of all the good things still to come. Ryder moved into the rooms behind the store, and they began building a life together. He took a job as a deputy to Sheriff Jenkins, work that kept him in town rather than ranging across the territory. It paid less than his marshal work, but he found he didn't care. Coming home to Helena every evening was worth more than any salary. They settled into routines that felt right. Helena ran the store during the day, and Ryder walked the town, keeping peace and helping where needed. Evenings they spent together, sometimes with Helena's students if it was a lesson night, sometimes alone, talking and planning their future. Helena's dream of a lending library came to fruition within the year. She ordered books from a supplier in Chicago, everything from practical guides to novels to poetry collections. And she set up a corner of the store with comfortable chairs and a policy that anyone could borrow books as long as they promised to return them in good condition. The library became a gathering place, especially for the women and children of Nogales, who had few other sources of entertainment or education. Helena's literacy classes expanded, and Ryder found himself helping sometimes, working with older boys who were shy about learning in front of the younger children. "You're good at this," Helena told him one evening after a particularly successful lesson where a 15-year-old boy had finally grasped the concept of reading simple sentences. "You have patience I didn't expect." "I like helping people build something," Ryder admitted. "All those years tracking criminals, I was always dealing with things after they'd gone wrong. This feels like preventing problems before they start." Helena kissed him softly. "I'm proud of you, of who you've become since we met." "I'm who I always was," Ryder protested. "You just helped me remember." Their first year of marriage wasn't without challenges. There were days when Ryder's old fears surfaced, when he'd pull back emotionally, and Helena would have to gently draw him out again. There were times when Helena's stubborn independence clashed with Ryder's protective instincts, leading to arguments that they had to learn to navigate. But they worked through each difficulty together, with honesty and patience and a commitment to understanding each other. Ryder learned that love wasn't about avoiding conflict, but about choosing to work through problems rather than running from them. Helena learned that accepting help didn't diminish her strength, that letting Ryder support her was different from the dependence that had trapped so many women she'd known. The turning point came during a harsh winter, when illness swept through Nogales and Helena threw herself into caring for the sick. She worked until she collapsed, and Ryder found her unconscious in the store one morning, her fever burning so hot he thought his heart would stop. For 3 days he nursed her, barely sleeping, spooning water and broth into her when she was lucid enough to swallow, bathing her with cool cloths when the fever raged highest. Maria and other women from town came to help, but Ryder refused to leave Helena's side for more than moments at a time. On the 4th day, the fever broke. Helena opened her eyes to find Ryder sitting beside the bed, unshaven and exhausted, holding her hand. "You stayed," she whispered. "Where else would I be?" Ryder replied, his voice rough with emotion. "You're my life, Helena, my home, my heart." "I'm not going anywhere," she cried then, tears of relief and love, and Ryder held her carefully, mindful of her weakness. When she was strong enough to speak again, she said, "I was so scared, not of dying, but of leaving you alone again. I don't want you to be alone ever again." "You're not leaving me," Ryder said firmly. "We have years ahead of us, Helena. Decades. A whole life to build together." And they did build that life, piece by piece, just as Helena had promised. The store prospered as Nogales grew, the border town becoming more established with each passing year. Helena's library became famous throughout the region. People traveling from other towns to borrow books or attend the lectures and readings she organized. Ryder became sheriff when Jenkins retired, and he worked to make Nogales a place where law and order meant protection rather than oppression, where disputes could be settled fairly and everyone, regardless of background, received equal treatment. It wasn't always easy. Prejudice ran deep, and the border location meant complications with federal laws and jurisdictional questions. But Ryder was patient and fair, and gradually he earned the respect of nearly everyone in town. 2 years into their marriage, Helena told him she was pregnant. They'd talked about children, wanted them, but the reality of becoming parents still felt overwhelming and wonderful in equal measure. "I'm scared," Ryder admitted that night, his hand resting on Helena's still flat stomach. "What if I'm not a good father? What if I pass on my cynicism, my fears?" "You'll be an amazing father," Helena said with certainty. "You're patient and kind, and you've shown me over and over that you're capable of extraordinary love when you let yourself. Our child will be lucky to have you." Their son was born in the spring of 1881, a healthy baby with Ryder's dark hair and Helena's brown eyes. They named him James, after Helena's father, and Ryder felt something shift in his chest the first time he held his son. This tiny, helpless human depending on him for everything. It was terrifying and humbling, and filled him with a fierce, protective love he'd never imagined possible. "I understand now," he told Helena one night as they watched James sleep in his cradle. "Why you were willing to risk your heart on me. This feeling, this love, it's worth any risk. It's worth everything." Helena smiled, tired but radiant in the lamplight. "I told you so." They had 2 more children over the next 5 years, a daughter named Sarah and another son they called Daniel. The rooms behind the store became too small, and they built a house on the edge of town. A real home with enough bedrooms for their growing family, and a porch that faced the desert where Ryder and Helena still sat in the evenings, watching the sun set while their children played. Ryder watched his children grow with a sense of wonder that never quite faded. He taught James to ride, to shoot, to track signs in the desert. He read to Sarah every night, fostering her love of books that rivaled her mother's. He played with Daniel, the baby who seemed to find joy in everything, whose laughter could lighten even the hardest days. And through it all, his love for Helena only deepened. She was his partner in every sense, running their household and her business with equal skill, raising their children to be kind and educated and brave. She continued her teaching, her advocacy for education, her quiet work to make Nogales a better place. There were still hard times. Ryder lost friends in the line of duty, and each death reminded him how precious and fragile life was. Helena had a miscarriage between Sarah and Daniel, a loss that grieved them both deeply. They weathered droughts and economic troubles, the challenges of raising children in a harsh land where danger was never far away. But they weathered everything together, and that made all the difference. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Ryder surprised Helena with a trip to Tucson. They left the children with Maria, who'd become like family over the years, and spent 3 days alone together in a real hotel, with hot baths and restaurant meals and time to simply be husband and wife, rather than parents and business owners and community leaders. On their last evening, they walked through Tucson's plaza as the sun set, hand in hand like young courting couple. "Are you happy?" Ryder asked, the question that sometimes still worried at him in quiet moments. Helena stopped walking and turned to face him, her face older now but no less beautiful, marked by laughter lines and the experience of a life fully lived. "Ryder Walsh, you made me happier than I ever dreamed possible. You took a chance on love when every instinct told you to run, and you've spent every day since proving that trust and commitment and partnership are real. I am so happy. Are you?" Ryder pulled her close, kissing her there in the fading light with all the passion and tenderness of the love they'd built. "I am. I really am. You convinced me to believe in love again, Helena, and it's the best thing that ever happened to me." They returned to Nogales, to their children and their home and their life, and the years continued to unfold. James grew into a thoughtful young man who wanted to study law, determined to follow his father's dedication to justice. Sarah became a teacher, taking over Helena's literacy classes and expanding them into a proper school. Daniel inherited Helena's head for business and helped run the store, which had grown into the largest mercantile in the region. Ryder and Helena watched their children build their own lives, find their own loves, start their own families. They became grandparents, a role that suited them both, spoiling the grandchildren in ways they'd never indulged their own kids. On warm evenings, they still sat on their porch, now with rocking chairs that accommodated aging bodies but spirits that remained young. They'd talk about the past, about the day Ryder rode into town bleeding and skeptical and so determined to stay alone. They'd laugh about how quickly Helena had seen through his defenses, how she'd refused to let him hide. "I was terrified of you," Ryder admitted one evening when they were both in their 50s, still healthy and active but aware of time's passage. "That first night when you fixed my shoulder and saw right through me, I wanted to run so badly." "I know," Helena said, taking his hand, "but you stayed. You chose courage over fear, and look at everything we built because of it." They looked out at their view, the desert they'd both come to love, the town that had grown around them, the family they'd created together. It had been a good life, full of love and purpose, and the kind of contentment that comes from building something meaningful. Ryder leaned over to kiss his wife, this woman who'd changed everything, and whispered, "Thank you for not giving up on me, for teaching me that love is real." "Thank you for letting me love you," Helena replied, "for trusting me with your heart." As the sun set over Nogales, painting the desert in shades of gold and crimson, Ryder Walsh knew with absolute certainty that every fear he'd overcome, every risk he'd taken, every moment of vulnerability had been worth it. Helena had promised him that love was worth believing in, and she'd spent their life together proving it, day after day, year after year. He'd been so skeptical about love, had thought his heart too damaged to ever heal. But Helena had convinced him otherwise, not with grand gestures or empty promises, but with steady devotion and honest partnership and the kind of deep, abiding love that transforms everything it touches. Their children visited often, bringing grandchildren who filled the house with noise and laughter. The store remained successful, passed down to Daniel, who ran it with the same integrity Helena had established. James practiced law in Tucson, but came home regularly, proud of his parents and the example they'd set. Sarah's school was now an established institution, funded by the territorial government and serving children from all over the region. As they entered their 60s, Ryder finally retired from his position as sheriff, turning the badge over to a younger man he'd trained personally. Helena gradually reduced her hours at the store, though she never quite stopped working entirely. They had more time together, took long walks in the cooler morning hours, hosted family dinners every Sunday. Their love remained constant, the foundation everything else was built upon. They still talked every evening, still sought each other's counsel, still found ways to make each other laugh. The passion of their early days had mellowed into something deeper and more sustaining, a love that was both comfortable and profound. When Helena fell ill in her 67th year, a sickness the doctor couldn't quite name that left her weak and fading, Ryder was beside her constantly, just as he'd been during that winter fever so many years before. Their children came, gathering around, and Helena held court from her bed, offering advice and love to each of them. But it was Ryder she wanted most, Ryder's hand she held through the long nights, Ryder she talked with about their life together. No regrets. She asked him one evening when they were alone. "Not a single one," Ryder said truthfully. "Every day with you was a gift, Helena. You saved me from a life of loneliness and cynicism. You showed me that hope and love and trust were real. You gave me a family, a purpose, a home. How could I possibly regret any of it?" "I'm sorry to leave you," Helena whispered. "Don't apologize for something you can't control," Ryder said, though his heart was breaking. "You've loved me for 40 years, Helena. That's more than most people get in a lifetime. I'm grateful for every moment." Helena smiled, the expression weak but genuine. "You were worth the effort, Ryder Walsh. Worth every conversation, every patient explanation, every day of proving that love could be trusted. I'd do it all again." She passed peacefully 3 days later, surrounded by family, Ryder holding her hand as she slipped away. The grief was crushing, but Ryder found he could bear it because of everything Helena had taught him. Love was worth the pain of loss. Connection was worth the risk of heartbreak. A life lived fully, with openness and vulnerability, was infinitely better than safety purchased through isolation. Ryder lived another 8 years, watching his grandchildren grow, taking joy in his children's continued success, remaining an active part of the Nogales community that he and Helena had helped shape. He never remarried, how could he, when he'd already had the love of his life? But he wasn't alone. He had family, friends, purpose, all the things Helena had convinced him to open his heart to. On a summer evening in 1921, Ryder Walsh sat on his porch one last time, looking out at the desert sunset. He was 72 years old, and he could feel his body winding down, ready for rest. The town of Nogales had changed dramatically from the rough border settlement he'd ridden into so many years ago, but its heart remained good, shaped in part by the values he and Helena had championed. He thought about his life, about the angry, wounded man he'd been, and the person Helena had helped him become. He thought about his children and grandchildren, the legacy of love that would continue long after he was gone. He thought about Helena, waiting for him, and he smiled. "I'm coming, love," he said softly to the desert air. "Thank you for teaching me that love was real. Thank you for saving me from myself. Thank you for the most amazing life a man could ask for." The sun set in gold and crimson, and Ryder Walsh closed his eyes, filled with gratitude for the woman who'd seen past his defenses to the man underneath, who'd refused to let him hide, who'd convinced him that love was worth every risk. He'd been so skeptical, so certain that his heart was too broken to ever heal. But Helena Morrison had proven him wrong in the best possible way, and their love story had become legend in Nogales, the wounded lawman and the determined shopkeeper who'd built a life together based on trust, patience, and the transformative power of honest, steadfast love. Their children made sure the story was passed down, told to grandchildren and great-grandchildren as an example of what love could accomplish. The lending library Helena founded was renamed in her honor, and the school Sarah ran taught values of education and equality that Helena had championed. Daniel's children inherited the store, now a landmark that had served Nogales for over 50 years. And in the cemetery outside town, under a cottonwood tree with a view of the desert they'd both loved, 2 headstones stood side by side. The inscriptions were simple, just names and dates, but everyone in Nogales knew the story they represented. It was a story of second chances, of healing and growth, of love that overcame fear and cynicism to build something lasting and beautiful. Ryder Walsh had been skeptical about love, had protected his wounded heart with walls of solitude and constant movement. But Helena Morrison had seen through those defenses to the good man underneath, and she'd patiently, persistently convinced him that love was worth believing in after all. Together they'd created a life full of meaning, raised a family, helped build a community, and proved that even the deepest wounds can heal when met with genuine care and devotion. Their story became part of Nogales itself, woven into the fabric of the town's history. Young couples would visit their graves, hoping some of that legendary love would bless their own relationships. Older residents who'd known Ryder and Helena personally would share memories of their kindness, their dedication to making their corner of the world better. The house they'd built together remained in the family for generations, each new occupant feeling the warmth and love that had been its foundation. The porch where they'd spent countless evenings talking and watching the sunset became a cherished space, where important conversations happened and family bonds were strengthened. Helena's teaching methods, emphasizing patience and meeting students where they were, became the standard for education throughout the region. Ryder's approach to law enforcement, focused on fairness and community service rather than intimidation, influenced how policing was done in border towns for decades to come. But perhaps their greatest legacy was the simple proof they offered that love can heal, that broken hearts can mend, that choosing vulnerability over safety leads to a richer, more meaningful life. Ryder had been so certain that protecting himself was the only way to survive, and Helena had shown him that living fully, risking pain for the chance at joy, was infinitely better. In the end, it was a love story that proved the power of patience, persistence, and genuine human connection. Helena had seen a wounded man determined to stay alone and had decided he was worth saving. Ryder had been brave enough, despite his fears, to let himself be saved. Together, they'd built something beautiful that lasted long after they were gone, a testament to the transformative power of love when given freely and received with courage. The Wild West was a hard land, unforgiving and often cruel, but it was also a place where people could reinvent themselves, where the past didn't have to determine the future, where love could bloom in unexpected places. Ryder Walsh and Helena Morrison had found each other in that harsh, beautiful country, and they'd created a love story for the ages, proving that even the most skeptical heart can learn to believe again when met with the right person at the right time. Their story reminded everyone who heard it that love is a choice, made daily through small acts of kindness and understanding. It's built in kitchens and on porches, through conversations and shared work, by showing up consistently and choosing partnership over isolation. It's not about grand romantic gestures, but about steady devotion, about seeing someone fully and choosing to love them anyway, about believing that together you can build something better than either could achieve alone. And so, in a small cemetery outside Nogales, Arizona, under a cottonwood tree with the desert stretching endlessly in all directions, two headstones stood as a permanent reminder that love, real love, is always worth the risk. Ryder Walsh had been skeptical, but Helena Morrison had convinced him otherwise, and in doing so, they'd created a legacy that would inspire generations to come to be brave enough to open their hearts, patient enough to work through difficulties, and wise enough to recognize that love, in the end, is what makes life worth living.